In making these videos, I've been using two keyboards, a piano keyboard to construct scales and keys, and a simplified keyboard to construct chords and explain chord progressions. This has probably been to the confusion of newbies and the horror of professionals. But in this video, a kind of extra to the series, I want to show why there shouldn't be any confusion and why there shouldn't be any horror either. The great thing about using a limited keyboard is that it is, well, limited. There are no extra notes to worry or wonder about, and if you're writing in the key of C major or A minor, it's a good representation of the white keys you'd be playing anyway. In fact, this kind of representation isn't far from the piano roll style that is used in some kinds of computer software, and which is supposedly easier for non-musicians to use and understand. In fact, many non-musicians can't understand why musicians still insist on using an old-fashioned system full of weird symbols. They think it's a jumbled and archaic mess, cobbled together by a bunch of illogical pre-scientific ignoramuses in those few spare moments when they weren't out burning witches. Still, that doesn't mean that the already streamlined system I'm using can't be improved. Take the sheer size of it. Not many instruments, except for two-handed instruments like the piano, have that kind of range. And if we're only using it to show theory, we can do with a lot less. Let's chop it down a bit then. Our choice of size is basically arbitrary, but we can take some guidance from the sort of thing we've been doing already. We were using C major and A minor in all our earlier examples, because then we wouldn't have to worry about sharps and flats. So we'll continue to use C major as our standard. In fact, we'll create our slimmed-down keyboard around it. We'll put C in the middle and use our major scale pattern to generate the other 6 keys. We'll probably want a little more space though. Enough, let us say, so that we can build all the chords on all the roots of the scale. To do that, we'll have to add 5 spaces on either side of C, giving us 11 spaces altogether. Here are the chords we can build. Notice how each note in the scale gets to be the root of a chord, and all the chords fit neatly within our borders. If we need extra spaces, we can add them on an ad hoc basis. This design also leaves the roots of the C major primary chords easy to find, being located on the space in the middle and one in from the sides. This gives the keyboard a nice symmetry. This keyboard is tuned to C major. To tune it to another key, to B major let us say, we would take out our 12-tone keyboard and, starting with a tonic of the new key, use our major key pattern to find its notes. These we would then apply to our limited keyboard. This would put the tonic of our new key in the middle, preserving the design we wanted. Well, that might be an advantage. On the other hand, it would be cumbersome to constantly shift the labels around. Nor is it much of a savings on clarity. Compare the keyboard for B major to the keyboard for C major. The only difference is that the B major keyboard is shifted up by 1 space and has acquired a bunch of sharps. If we shift the B major keyboard down 1 space and copy the sharps to the C major keyboard, then the two become identical. It would be simpler then if we kept the layout of our C major keyboard, with C in the middle, and just used our 12-tone keyboard to identify which spaces get sharps or flats when we change to another key. Then we would just apply those sharps or flats to our C major keyboard, giving us the new tuning without having to shift the labeling around. Notice how it's just as easy to measure intervals and build chords in B major as it is in C major. The sharps and flats that are so much trouble on a piano keyboard, those are just labels, decals almost, that get stuck onto the spaces of our keyboard here. And it's the spaces themselves, not their labels, that we are interested in. The only other thing that we need to do is keep track of where our tonic note is, so that we can keep track of the 4 and 5 notes and all the rest. Of course, there's not much we have to shift around anyway. When you get down to it, you only have to label 1 space, because all the other labels would be arranged relative to it. Labeling the middle line as C, for instance, tells us where F and G and all the rest of the notes are, without us having to label them. This keyboard, then, simplifies to this, and this one simplifies to this. It's left to the reader, as a very simple exercise, to deduce the names of the unlabeled spaces and the keys that they are tuned to. So there's some graphical savings, a standardized layout suitable for any major or minor key, shorn of all but the information absolutely necessary to infer everything else, matter which is easily inferred from what remains. It's still a little hard to read, though. It would be easier to read if we alternated colors on the spaces. Let's use black and white. No. Let's use red and white. That way we're not tempted to think that the red spaces are the black keys of the piano keyboard when they're not. Now we have C sitting on a red space in the middle, with 2 red spaces and 3 white spaces above it, and 2 red spaces and 3 white spaces below it. This system isn't bad for showing notes rising or falling in pitch, but it's rotten at showing them extending in time. We need to show that because from here on out we'll be talking more about chord sequences, chains of successive chords, and less about individual chords. To give our keyboard temporal extension, we'll take inspiration from the piano roll GUIs used in so much software, and turn our keyboard on its side and stretch it. The far left now will be early in the piece, and the passage of time will be marked by marching to the right. We won't worry about note durations, though. We're not interested right now in rhythm or in how long the notes will be held, so we'll just continue to use a solid dot to mark each note, and never mind how long that note is held for. That's something we'll figure out when the time comes. So here's what a succession of chords will look like: C major, F major, G major. It's still kind of hard to read, though. Everything is stretched so far apart, the eye really can't take it in at a glance. So let's make our spaces thinner. There's no information in the thickness of a space, after all, so this is just as good as we had before. So is this. In fact, we can go so far as to shrink our red spaces down into lines, with the dots hanging on the red lines instead of lodging inside them. And if we need to move outside our system, above it or below it, we'll just add a little tick mark there, instead of an entire new row. The chords now stack neatly and tightly, and instead of looking like dots floating around, they look like unified figures, easy to take in at a glance. Now, don't be frightened by the curious resemblance between our limited system here and the traditional staff system. This really is just a redesign of something we've been using all this time. It's just been tightened up and turned sideways. Really, if you can read this, you can read this, just by tilting your head. And if we're going to be talking about chords, their structure, and their relationships, it's much easier to read this, to recognize which of those chords are in root position and which are in inversion, which is a C major chord, which is an A minor chord, and which is a D minor chord, than it is to glean the same information from this. To make it easier on myself, though, from this point forward I will be using a traditional staff system when making these videos. But I won't get fancy or anything. I won't be using key signatures, we'll stick to C major, or time signatures, and I also won't be showing off different rhythms. But instead of showing dots on a fat keyboard, I'll be hanging egg-like whole notes on a staff. You'll just have to remember that the middle line is C. That weird doohickey on the left end of the staff should help. Notice how those bowed half circles, like backward C's, point to the middle line. And then you should be able to see that this familiar layout, and the new one, are just stylistic variations on each other.